Hi, Angela.
Hi, Molly. How nice to see you today.
You too. Thank you for taking the time to share your favourite books.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely. Great treat
I
on
know
a
that
horrible
you
day.
have it's been quite tricky for you because you have a big selection of books that you have read.
Well, let's face it. If I started when I was 8 and I'm now
A bit older.
whatever I am, that's over 60 years of reading. So it's quite hard, isn't it, when you do, quite a lot. I think, going right back to the fact that you get read to as a child. But I think I'll have to start with Enid Blyton, but I can't talk about Enid Blyton on this. But I say thank you to Enid Blyton for getting me into reading. She was magic.
Yeah,
so
I think
that's how it started. But anyway, I've now developed into all sorts of areas, but I think history, I'm very keen on history, and a good story, a real thumping good story, which is based on truth, but it's a novel. And this is one of my favorite authors who I've just picked at random, Isabel Allende, who is Chilean.
Before you talk about her, do you want to just, I know that you have an amazing book where you've sort of written all the books that you've read, which I think is such a great idea. Yeah.
Well,
I think that's amazing.
It's not quite full, but actually I do find it quite useful to go back. And I try and write a tiny bit about each book so that you can recall it, because I've now had to start reading books again. I've got to that stage in life where I'm rereading. I think you get to that stage, but I've just got to it now. So I'm just rereading a book at the moment, which I loved years ago, but it had so much relevance to now. So that's that. But should I talk about Isabel Allende?
Yeah, let's go back to her. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Brilliant. No, I picked on her because of the history element and the fact that she was from Chile, but she always felt she never quite belonged when she had to leave when the coup came along in 1972. And it was relevant for me because my mother was born and brought up in Chile, and her sister and all her lovely cousins and loads of friends were in Chile. So Chile has been a go-to place for me ever since. And I've been there many times. And my mother entertained all the Chileans when they came over, when they were chucked out in the 1972 coup with somebody called Allende. But this Allende is nothing to do, she's a niece, but she's not political from that point of view. But she had to leave then as well. And it was all very awkward and difficult. But this story is about, it starts off very much in the Spanish Civil War, which I think is very interesting for you too, because of your lovely uncle and aunt who got a house there. Mm. And your uncle gave such a brilliant discussion when I was staying with him about the Spanish Civil War, which is incredibly complicated, because you had Franco on one side and you had the liberators on the other side, and there was tremendous carnage, and it was the most ridiculously sad bloodbath of all bloodbaths. But this Isabel Allende was writing, it starts off in the Spanish Civil War, and this wonderful man called Victor is there. He's got a brother, and the brother is married to this lovely girl whose name I haven't written down. But eventually they have to make a run for it because the brother actually is killed, but we don't know that to begin with. But Victor takes this lovely wife who's heavily pregnant out of Spain into France. But when they get to France, there's nothing but concentration camps, where they call them, places to stay. But the two of them end up in these concentration, and they're incredibly starved and badly treated. But it's ridiculous in a way, because it's just over the border into France. But they were very lucky, because there was a poet who's very famous in Chile called Pablo Neruda, who organizes a ship to take the most interesting people, but you had to have some reason to get on the ship. And he eventually, these two managed to get onto the ship to Chile, where they then have a life. And it becomes obvious that the brother has died and the wife has a little boy, but eventually the two of them move in together, and after many, many years, they actually realize that they're made for each other. They get married. So that's really the base of the story. But it's all there, the Chilean connection. And what I love is that it starts in Spain, which I know quite well, because my daughter lives in Mallorca, and I've been to Spain obviously many times, but I like the fact that they actually went to Chile. So there we go.
Wow.
That's
is it based on a true story?
Definitely, yes. The Pablo Neruda ship was real. I mean, the rest, and the Spanish Civil War, what happened in Spain and in France, the concentration camps and all that, are completely real. The character Victor was just plucked out of the air. But, you know, it was based on true events in whenever it was, in the 1930s. And, you know, after that, it was just the most ridiculous bloodshed. So they were terribly lucky, these two, to end up in Chile and have a particularly good life over there, which, you know, Isabel Allende, once she left Chile, she always felt that she belonged there and wanted to go back. And I have a feeling it connected to me very much, because I always feel that my mother had the same feeling about, you know, her upbringing was there.
Yeah.
And she ended up living in England, which you know, she enjoyed very much. But she always felt that maybe she was a bit of an outsider. And I think it relates to people who live in a place which isn't where they were born and brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And possibly I might relate to it myself, because I live in Scotland and I wasn't born and brought up here. So maybe I feel an outsider too. So it relates to me in so many different ways to how you live your life right now.
Why is it called it's long petal of the sea, isn't it?
Yes, well, that's Chile. It's the shape. You see, Chile is a long, thin country. So it's literally like that. So Pablo Neruda called it the long petal of the sea. So he wrote a poem called The Long Petal of the Sea, which is basically, it goes from the north, which is a desert, and then it goes right the way down through every climate you can imagine. So Santiago, where they all live, is like the south of France. And then you go to south, and you get to a place which is similar to Scotland. And then you go south even more, and you get to almost an ice cap. So that's why it's a long petal of the sea. So you've got the Atlantic one side, and you've got the Andes the other side. So the Andes just go on forever and ever. And I flew once over the Andes from Santiago up to the desert, which was like 2 hours going over, or 3-4 hours going over nothing but the Andes. So big. And, you know, it's just it's a very lovely country, because you can, you know, it's got everything going for it, but it's long and thin, basically, rather than short and fat.
Right. I looked up Pablo Neruda actually briefly, because I saw he was linked in with this story, and he looks like he was a pretty impressive gentleman, and saved lots of the Spaniards' lives, I think.
Yes.
And he was a poet as well, was he?
Well, he was a poet, and he gets quoted a lot. I've never really sort of got really into his poems, but they, throughout other books and other things I read, maybe Isabel Allende's other books that she's written, he gets mentioned all the time. And I think he gets mentioned, that his poetry gets mentioned in Spain and everywhere. I mean, he's a very, very famous poet, but, you know, he's basically Chilean. And he has got, he's somebody I would like to maybe read his poems and study a bit more. But anyway, Isabel Allende now lives in America, so she always feels like an outcast in America, but she certainly makes a lot of writes the most incredible books. Always very exciting. You know, there's always a very good racing plot. And her first book was called The House of the Spirits, which is very much about how you feel about your family going back. So that, you know, when you've got a grandmother, let's say, and your mother and I have similarities. Our mothers died before our children were born. And therefore, your mum and I always had this conversation about how we felt they were looking down, or at least this is how I feel, that grannies that you don't have, that you've missed out on, are looking down at you, at my children and you guys, which is quite an important feeling. You must have that feeling. Otherwise, you know, you're not grounded, because, you know, you see lots of people with grannies that are still alive, and you think, blimey, that is so unfair. It's so ridiculous. My mother died 40 years ago, and Granny up there, she died quite young too. So my mother was never able to show us off to her mother. So I'm very much sort of in touch with my grandmother, and I don't know why. It's just a sort of thing in my head. And I don't, you know, a lot of people know their grandmothers, know everything about them, but I still feel I know her, despite the fact that I've never met her.
That's really
so
nice.
Well, it's quite a nice way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm sure your mum would say the same, actually, about the fact that her mother died young. I don't know, did you have any other grannies?
No.
No, well, there you are. You see, I had no granny for me and no granny for my children. So that's why when I meet somebody with a granny, I would say, oh, you're so lucky to have a granny.
Well, we're pretty lucky too, because we've got our moral compass up in the sky always.
Yes. Well, no, I agree. I've had some lovely older cousins and people and aunts and uncles. So I can't say that I'm missing out entirely, but there's a special bond between a granny and, you know, which is stronger, I feel, because it's a direct line to, anyway, no, I've managed without a granny. I mean, I've managed to get by. But it's always been something that is quite important, you know, that you know, anything I can find out about my granny, I want to know about. So as a result, I'm quite keen on family history. But I feel that's something that you get to when you're sort of older, you know, like in your 40s, 50s, rather than now. Rather, I mean, you're too young to be fascinated, and that's the way it is, you know. I mean, it's quite interesting, but it's not essential. It does hit me when I was a bit sort of, you know, a bit older.
Yeah, maybe. Well, it kind of shapes who you are.
Yeah. Anyway, Isabel Allende, she writes a lot and quite often about Chile and about people traveling out of Chile. So I can't really think at the top of my head other books, but anyway, that's her. But
she's written quite a lot, hasn't she?
Yes, I should think. Yes, I mean, she had a very sad, her daughter died, so she wrote a wonderful book about her daughter. And the other book I enjoyed very much was called Daughter of Fortune, about a girl who decided, she had a broken romance in Chile, so she decided to go on a boat, and she ended up in California, in San Francisco. So it was a description very much about the gold rush of California, how California was established. Because, you know, people thought gold, hooray, so they raced across from the east. So they got to California and they built up a very interesting town now, which is, you know, thriving. But 100 years ago, you know, it was still quite a new place. So it's interesting to see how California developed. And that was Daughter of Fortune.
Oh, so she always writes about something she knows or has a personal sort of connection.
Yes, I would say. Yeah, on the whole, I think it's very much to do with feelings. What's the word? I think she just talks to me about people, how they feel, how they react. So she's very much appeals to my how I just find her very readable, and she always has a good story. It's just a really good story. I think that's quite important in books.
Very. It's
very.
Yeah. Well, I haven't actually read any of her books, but I will definitely look them up now. So
well, look them up. You might. It might not be for you. I'm just picking out her because she's sort of she comes and goes pretty well, quite a lot.
Okay. Well, my first book is Scottish nursery rhymes.
Yes.
And this is because I was listening to a talk because they're putting these Scottish nursery rhymes to music and getting sort of actual children, recordings of actual children singing them. And so I bought the book of the poems to have a look at what they're like. And I think, well, a book of the nursery rhymes at least. And I think it's really important because I was looking up sort of history of nursery rhymes and things before chatting with you. And in childhood, it's when we sort of start to learn a language and when we learn about our culture, and it's sort of where it's all planted and begins. And rhymes and sort of singing chants and things are really important for children because it kind of gives them a sense of rhythm, teaches them about rhythm, about poetry, about timing, all these sort of things that we then take for granted when we get a bit older. And there's a really sweet bit at the beginning that the Montgomeries have written saying that Walter de la Mare, who wrote, was a great poet as well, said that his one drop of Scottish blood began to dance when he heard these nursery rhymes, which I think is so nice.
That's brilliant. That is so brilliant because it's not in Gaelic. They're not in Gaelic, are they?
They're in, well, I'll show you a couple in a second, but they're sort of the movement for getting these put to music is because they think that even though they're quite sort of in old Scots, they should still be shared with Scottish children because they're our heritage. And that the oral tradition and reciting and singing is such an important part of us as human beings. So it's really good to try to encourage that and to keep sort of the Scottish language going a bit too. So it's full of lovely pictures and lots of lovely rhymes. There are, I haven't looked through it all, but there was one I recognized, which was, it's Dance to Your Daddy, My Little Laddie.
Well, do you know, that's one of my favourites. I tell you why, because it's from Northumberland.
Oh, is
Dance
it?
to your daddy, my little laddie. Dance to your daddy, my little man.
Yeah. Then you'll get a fishy.
In a little dishy.
Yeah.
That's Northumbrian. I'm sure. I'll check it out.
Well, it's in here.
Well, do you know something? That's one of my favourites because I used to sing that to my children, I think, because I always thought it was a Northumbrian one, but then you see Northumberland was part of Scotland, and I came from Northumberland. Well, okay, which is pretty well Scotland actually. So it was maybe I tell you where that came from in a way, were the fishing villages along the east coast of Scotland, and maybe would have gone down to Northumberland.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that one was really nice. And then there's another one, Bobby Shafto's Gone to Sea.
Yes.
I don't know how that goes.
Bobby Shafto came to town with a
Gone to sea, silver buckles on his knee. He'll come back and marry me. Bobby
Shafto. Can I tell you something, Molly? You wouldn't believe this, but I had a next door neighbour called Bobby Shafto. I promise you. Absolutely promise. No, Bobby Shafto is a Northumbrian. I think that's brilliant. I must look that up. Bobby Shafto.
And then Bobby Shafto's, he doesn't sound very nice. Fat and fair, combing down his yellow hair. He's my love forevermore, Bobby Shafto.
that is definitely Northumberland. But I love it because Scotland and Northumberland, Molly, just changing the subject rather too quickly, is the borders. You know the thing about Scottish independence. Well, Rory Stewart said that the borders was Scotland, but it was from Edinburgh right the way down to Newcastle, almost, that chunk, that huge chunk he considers the borders. It's neither Scotland or England. So how can you have a border when you get this chunk in the middle, which is the border country, which is basically farmers, and it was where all the border reivers were, you know, when Scotland and England were having a tussle, they ended up in the border country. So, you know, where I was Hadrian's Wall. And then above that were all the border, you know, the border castles, where everyone went border reiving, i.e. stealing each other's sheep. Oh dear.
Yeah, well, you should definitely look up the nursery rhymes.
I'd
Maybe
love
they'll
that.
take you back.
What's it called? Tell me who wrote it.
Norah and William Montgomerie.
Norah
and William Montgomerie.
Are they? I will. I think that's a brilliant book. I love that.
What's your next book?
Okay, well, I think I said Nancy Mitford, but it's very much a book that I was brought up on because my mother, to kick off, loved it. It was very much, if you like, she's quite a snob, which sounds awful. It's not the way to recommend a book because the author was a snob, but she just had a terribly good, sharp wit that she was able to take a wonderful, very eccentric family that really existed and make it into a book. And again, it was just a really good novel and full of the most fantastically eccentric characters that made you laugh out loud. I mean, it made my mother roar with laughter. I'm not saying that everything she read I liked, and very rarely that does, but honestly, I've never laughed so much in my entire life, and it was full of very funny characters, but she was very insightful at the same time. Mm-hmm. So there was, I said Love in a Cold Climate, which was very much about, it was a love story. But one she wrote was called The Blessing, and it was about a couple, and she was rather fey and rather sort of, rich girl, and he was rather a smooth Frenchman, and they had a little boy. Sorry, I got a cough. I'm gonna have to get some water. Hang on. Wait for 5 seconds. Terribly handsome, and they're a very devoted couple. But he obviously is quite naughty, and he can't resist a pretty face, so he quite often sneaks off and has an affair. and Polly, who's the heroine, catches him out and says, "That's it. I'm leaving you. End of story. We're parting. I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to go live on my own." And the little boy is called Sigismund. He's a very beautiful little boy, and he's very clever too, because he realizes he can play his parents off against each other. Because if he's with his daddy, he gets very spoiled. If he's with his mummy, he gets very spoiled. Anyway, a few years pass by, and he goes between the two parents, playing one off. Anyway, he suddenly realizes he's having a lot more fun when the parents are separated. Anyway, after a couple of years, the parents make up, and they decide they can't live without each other, and they go back together. And of course, the little boy does everything in his power to try and keep them apart. He's very naughty. Anyway, eventually he gets rumbled, and he gets into terrible trouble from his father, who says, "No, you just behave yourself." But it sounds like a very thin plot, but it's just a wonderful sort of way of a character study of children, really. And you can understand how the little boy would do it. But you change your mind a lot as you get older. Because when I first read it, I thought, what a spoiled little brat, he needs a thump. But as you get older, you realize that that's what happens. That's life. The parents caused the problem. And, but it was resolved in the end. But there's just wonderful characters that come and go, and wonderful, tea parties with this naughty Charles Edward, chatting up all the old ladies at tea, and they all think he's lovely, but in fact he's not. He's very naughty. But being French, he gets away with it, because when you're a very handsome Frenchman, very aristocratic, in these old ladies' eyes, you're allowed to have affairs. But that wouldn't go down terribly well with everyone.
Why is it called The Blessing?
Because the mother, Polly, calls Sigismund the Blessing. She calls him the Blessing all the time, because, you know, it's the one thing in her life which is important. Once her husband leaves her, or she leaves him, it's the one thing that she calls him the Blessing.
Oh, well,
but that Nancy Mitford based most of her novels on her family and growing up. And she grew up in a very large house with a very eccentric father and a very eccentric sisters. And they were the Mitford sisters, you might have heard of. And they all wrote incredibly, they all had different politics. So Nancy was, who was the writer, and the next one of them was a communist. Another one was married to a fascist, you know, during the Second World War, and went to prison because of that. Another one made friends with Hitler. And when she realized that Hitler was not as wonderful as she thought, she shot herself. And another one, the communist actually wrote a wonderful book called Ons and Rebels and went off to America. Or oh, that's right, when she was 18, she ran away with her cousin and married him, and they went and fought, her cousin fought in the Spanish Civil War. So, and then they ended up in America. And she then became a very famous writer in her own right. So they were sort of very interesting family. But it's all based, her books are based on this family. And, you know, it was just something that's, it's just witty and funny and a brilliant story.
So is The Blessing based on a true story, do you think?
No. Yes and no. Yes, it was actually. I think, sorry. Charles Edward was based, Nancy, the writer, went to live in Paris. And she had been married, but then she separated from her husband. She didn't have any children, but she fell madly in love with this Frenchman who used to come into her life and then out again. And she, till the day she died, she was madly in love with him. And I think that Charles Edward was probably based on him, because he had been married, and he just, you know, he was a war hero anyway. So he was always, he didn't work in Paris. He was always somewhere, but she didn't know where. So this was, I think Charles Edward was based on him.
Quite tough. I did read in sort of relation to this book, she said there are many types of love, but the best give people a reason for living.
Yes, yes.
And I guess that's sort of, I think that's really nice as well.
I think he was her inspiration for all her books. So there was always a wonderful Frenchman who popped into various, in the pursuit of love and love in a cold climate. There's always rather a dashing Frenchman who comes to the rescue. Love, I think it's Love in a Cold Climate. The Frenchman comes to the rescue of Linda, who gets lost at a railway station. Is very upset. So he says, come back with me, I'll look after you. And he looks after and spoils her. And eventually they get married, and she has a baby, but then I think she's killed at some point. And so and somebody else has to bring up the baby. So he appears at different times. So it's a sort of ongoing saga, but it's the same characters pop in and out of books throughout. But it's very much Nancy Mitford's observation of when I say an upper class family. So it can be a little bit snobby. It's not for everyone, this book. It's something that some people think, oh my God, it's too aristocratic and grand, but actually they're just a very interesting section of society.
Quite a sort of honest writer, I guess. Sort of
yes.
Just writing what she sees.
She's just a marvelous observer of humans. So they don't necessarily have to be upper echelons, but they just happen to be in this case. But she just observes people's, everything about them, and it's just I just find it. I can read. It's the kind of book you can reread.
Mm-hmm.
So every couple of years or 5 years, I might reread it,
Mm-hmm.
and I find it just as much fun.
Well, my next book you can reread as well all the time.
Good.
Because each chapter is kind of like a story. So it's taken me, I was trying desperately to finish it before chatting to you, but I haven't quite managed because I've been having to reread each chapter about 3 times just to sort of process everything that's going on. So
yes.
It's called The Story of San Michele that
yes.
I was recommended. And it's just the most beautiful story. It's written by Axel Munthe. I don't know if you know who that is.
No, but I'm going to write it down.
He was born, well, I'm just reading from the back here, but he was born in Sweden in 1857, and he trained to be a doctor in Paris at a precociously early age. He established a fashionable practice and had some very high-profile French people as his patients, and gained an international reputation. And he became friends of royalty. Tsar Nicholas asked him to look after his son. And then he moved to southern Italy to work for the poor and worked during typhus, cholera, and earthquake disasters. And he also devoted himself to rebuilding the ruined Tiberian villa of San Michele on Capri, which is where this is. I don't know if you've ever been to Capri. It's
yes, really, I have.
So beautiful. I don't know where San Michele is, but it's somewhere in Capri. And anyway, this story, it sort of charts, well, he's a very interesting man. He has a black poodle as well, like Mum. Black poodle.
What's not to like?
And each chapter is, I mean, I could talk about each chapter for a long time, because each one sort of has a different sort of place and a different adventure. And so it's just I've picked 1 or 2 that I
yes really give me a flavor.
Well, there's one chapter called Mansell Agata, and this is about one of his sort of housemaids in his house, and who he's tried to get rid of. They think he doesn't quite understand because he was she looked exactly the same as she did when she was in his childhood home in Sweden. And then so this lady looked after him when he was a boy, and then his elder brother had inherited her, and then eventually the older brother had succeeded in getting rid of her and passed her on to this man, Axel. And then Axel keeps trying to get rid of her as well. And he always invites his bachelor friends to come and stay, and is trying to sort of marry her off on them. And he nearly succeeds, but then they see what she looks like, and that's the end. They never want to see her again. And he says to describe what she looks like is beyond him. She had thin golden locks arranged in a sort of early Victorian fashion, and she had an exceptionally high and narrow forehead, no eyebrows, small white eyes, and hardly any face at all, only a long hook nose overhanging a narrow slit, which seldom opened to show a row of long pointed teeth like those of a ferret. The colour of her face and her fingers was a cadaverous blue. The touch of her hand was slimy and cold like that of a corpse. Her smile, no, I'm not going to tell you what her smile is like. It was what Rosie and I feared most. She only spoke Swedish and quarrelled fluently. And it just goes on, and she sounds like...
I'm hooked. You've hooked me on. In fact, I'll look it up because I'd love to read that.
She sounds like such an odious lady. And then there's another point where he's taking this man who has gone slightly mad to a lunatic asylum in Sweden. And when he's staying in his sort of B&B, he sees this this sign or this advert that they're doing Hamlet, a play of Hamlet, and he recognizes the man as an old friend of his, and so he goes, and they're in their sort of, this is the actors, the troupe's sort of final go of things, because they're all sort of falling apart. The ghost had got drunk and missed his train. Ophelia had a cold. The king was really sick. And so anyway, Axel stands in for them as the ghost. And Magnus, when they did Hamlet at school, Magnus was the ghost as well. So I really liked that bit. And anyway, he stands the ghost. And as he's standing, the back of the stage kind of collapses. So he ends up just hanging in his ghost costume, and you can only see his head. And all the audience love it. And he saves the day because they all think it's incredible that this ghost is just hanging there. And so when they come for their round of applause, they all shout for the ghost about 5 times, and he has to come back, and so he's really pleased that he manages.
What was his occupation? Was he a doctor?
He's a doctor, but then he goes and has all these incredible adventures as well. And just the way he writes about people, there's another bit where he has this huge, he's at a stag party with this huge Swedish man, and they're in a bar and they get mistaken for Germans, and a brawl breaks out, and then they have to go to prison, and they have to explain that they're at a stag party and the bride is waiting.
So he's quite wild. He's pretty wild. But the other thing, if he helped Tsar Nicholas with his child, did he meet Rasputin?
Yeah, well, they said Rasputin, I haven't got to that bit yet, but they said Rasputin was their second choice. So I guess maybe because he didn't actually, he was asked by Tsar Nicholas first, and then he said no, so then they asked Rasputin. Well,
you see, it was more the wife, it was more Nicholas's wife who got hold of Rasputin, because he was always meant to be a healer. He was meant to have sort of spiritual, something marvelous about him. In fact, he was completely ghastly. So, the story, there's so many sort of Rasputin stories, but it sounds fascinating because it's very much ties in with Russia. And last year I read so many books on Russia. There was a wonderful book called Red Notice, which was a true story about somebody who was working in Russia and got into, found out all the sort of horrors that were going on with the money that was going sideways. Instead of going into the communist system, it was going to all the oligarchs. And he sued somebody, and then he's now on what they call red notice. So whenever he travels, the Russian authorities are always trying to catch him. But it's the most fascinating. It's Red Notice. It's called by Bill Browder. It's one of my favorite books. And I also read A Good Man in Moscow. The Gentleman in Moscow. There's a wonderful book.
Oh yeah, I've read that. That's really good.
Yeah, it's very good. And
but
then
this book's more about Italy. I mean, it's sort of, he was asked by Tsar Nicholas, but Russia doesn't actually come into it. It's kind of the Axel's dream is to live in his villa in San Michele with his dogs and maybe a monkey. But he has to be a doctor in order to get enough money to then be able to afford to do up this villa, because it's pretty derelict. So that's why he ended up being a doctor.
But a doctor in Russia would be very interesting. The people he must have met at that time because of the revolution. Not quite. I mean, the revolution was coming, wasn't it, at that point?
Yeah, but he's not even a doctor in Russia. He's a doctor in Paris.
Okay.
And then he's a doctor in Rome. And it's just because he was asked by Tsar Nicholas to look after his son. I think that's the only.
Okay, well, it'd be interesting. I made a note of it.
It's still a really good book.
I made a note along with Bobby Shafto.
Yeah, you can, and it's just like I said, each chapter is a completely different story, and you meet the most incredible characters through it. And it's just the sort of story you could spend a year reading and still not quite have got it all. He must have been an incredibly people person, I think, and really approachable and just really fun and taking everyone for who they are. So I recommend it.
You've hit the nail on the head. And the other one is so difficult to choose, but the other books I've been reading, I've got into this woman called Kate Atkinson, who's much more now. When I say she's still a young person, well, young, I mean, she's in her 60s, I think now. And Nancy Mitford is long dead. And Isabel Allende is older than me, but Kate Atkinson, she's just, I just enjoy her writing. And there's something called, do you know what I mean by cozy murders? Murder mysteries, which aren't too violent, but they're kind of cozy and fun, like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers, that kind of thing. And I'm during lockdown, I've been watching a lot of Dorothy L. Sayers, this character called Lord Peter Wimsey, who is just the most wonderful, wonderful. I've fallen madly in love with him. He's absolutely lovely. And her books made into television are just brilliant. And I call them cozy murders because he sort of gets to the bottom of who done it. And so it's a sort of murder mystery. But he is a very, very intelligent man. And when you first come across him, you think he's, oh God, there's somebody at the door. Do you mind, can you turn off? So Kate Atkinson, I've read a lot of her books, but the one book that sticks in my head is a character called, he's called Jackson Brady. He's a detective, but he takes a slightly back seat in this particular story. And it is called Went Out Early, Took My Dog, which is a very odd title, but basically the story is loosely around a murder, but it starts off with this police woman, and she is just about to retire. She's very, she's a lovely, what I call a lovely cozy character, and she's never got married. She's not very glamorous. She lives on her own because her parents have died. She is what I call a proper good person. But during the course of her life as a police woman, she's seen the most appalling things happen. And one of them was that stuck in her head for a very long time was this little boy who was discovered after being locked in his mother's flat for 3 weeks, and the mother had died. She'd been murdered. And when this girl, Tracy, found him, there was, she sort of took such an interest in this little boy. She wanted to go and see him in hospital, and she wanted to look after him, or, you know, take an interest in his well-being. And she was kept away. She was made to not be anything to do with it. And so this is the beginning of the story, really, basically, or this is the background of what happened next. This is when she was quite young, this little boy, she found it. It's always stuck in her head. Whatever happened? Why was she not allowed to look after him and take an interest? Anyway, now we fast forward to now, and she's just decided to retire. And she is walking through a shopping centre, and she sees this woman who is absolutely one of the most diabolical characters, who's been in and out of jail. She's an absolute horror. And she's had a lot of children, and most of them been taken into care. So Tracy suddenly sees her pulling along this little girl who's screaming, you know, because she's just been treated incredibly badly. And Tracy, she snaps. She completely snaps. So she walks up to this woman who's behaving like the most appalling mother that ever was. And she says to her, "I'll buy your child." She happens to have quite a lot of money, which she's going to use as a retirement thing. And she says, "Can I buy your child?" And this woman goes, "Oh God, yes, how wonderful." She grabs the £3,000. And then Tracy takes the little girl and they go off and they have an adventure, basically. And it's just, you take it from there. And she's sort of on the run. And she decides to take the little girl home, and she goes off and she buys her some clothes, which she's obviously just never been looked after. She makes her a really nice sort of mince and potato, proper food, proper food to make her grow. And this little girl, she's rather quiet and rather sort of had the most appalling childhood, but is managing to be quite a sort of interesting. So she comes out of her shell eventually, the little girl, and Tracy bond. And Tracy then thinks, well, what the hell? I'm just retired. And this girl is going to have the most shitty life if she stays with her mother. And they go on the run, basically. And it's just so funny. I know it sounds awful. So Kate Atkinson is a terribly good person at seeing, at character development and finding characters. And Tracy, then it gets quite confusing because Jackson Pollock, who is the detective, has also been asked by
Jackson Brady.
Sorry, Jackson Brady.
The artist.
Jackson Brady. Sorry. Yeah, I get you see now. Jackson Brady, it sort of crosses over. He has actually been asked by somebody in Australia to find out about where he came from, because he'd been adopted. So basically, you get these two stories crossing over, and Jackson Brady, in fact, is on the lookout for a character to do with who he's trying to find, and Tracy thinks that he's after her and trying to capture, trying to stop her. But it gets quite complicated. It's a very amusing story. It's just rather sweet, but it's a typical Kate Atkinson, just a very good character story. But also it has a very serious side, because it does have a murder which gets resolved in the end, and a little bit of a police cover-up as to why this little boy that was stuck in a flat for 3 weeks, 30 years before. So it comes out it was a police cover-up, but we don't want to get there. But Jackson Brady, in fact, and Tracy eventually meet, and Tracy says, well, are you after me? And he said, no, I'm trying to get hold of this other, I'm trying to trace somebody else. But of course, the two stories tend to go together. So it was a very happy conclusion. But to actually take someone's child for 3,000 grand, I suppose morally is not such a great thing. But all the way through, I kept saying, thank you, because Tracy had so much love to give. And she'd never been able to give that love. And the mother was somebody who had children taken away and absolutely had no feelings for any of her children. So, this is a moral dilemma of what happens now today. The terrible people behave badly towards their children, and really lovely people don't have the opportunity to look. Anyway, so this is Tracy, and she's one of my favorite characters in Kate Atkinson. But she's done a body of work, a body of books.
Yeah, there are quite a lot of Jackson Brady books, aren't there?
Well, I think, you see, to start with, he is the number one person in the book. And he takes over, and he's it's wonderful. I mean, the stories are just terribly good. But it's basically what I call cozy murders. It's not, there's not, terrible things happen, but you don't actually get the feeling that. It's a bit like Agatha Christie. Yeah. I would put Agatha Christie into the cozy murders.
Kind of joie de vivre, even though it's a murder.
It's a murder, but it's a brilliant story, and there's not too much nasty bits. And it's a bit like Dorothy L. Sayers. She's the same. I mean, Lord Peter Wimsey works it out without. There's been a murder, but we don't know any of the sort of the true horror, the true horror of the murder.
Quite interesting as well, the way, you said it sort of does a time jump, does it, from sort of the beginning to the end? And
yes, I mean, that's quite
sort of time, whether people sort of harden against the world with time, or whether they sort of get raw rubbing against it and trying to help, I guess, maybe. Does it sort of deal with
Tracy, was a young, when she found this little boy being locked in a flat for 3 weeks with his dead mother, she was a young policewoman, and she did as she was told at the time, which was to keep away. When she went to hospital, just keep away and have nothing more to do with this. We're taking, and the superior policeman said, we're taking control. I won't give the, but it was a cover-up basically. And then when she got to the point of retiring and her life was hers, she just did what she wanted, i.e. she then bought this child off the most despicable mother that ever lived. And hopefully it was a happy ending. I mean, I think it would be a happy ending. I think we can rely on that. Kate Atkinson. But I mean, she's written, her first book I ever read was called Behind the Scenes of the Museum, which is basically about her looking back on her grandparents and her great-grandparents and seeing where things went wrong, where her parents were bad parents because of the parenting that they got from their parents, and things that had gone wrong because of, every generation there was a terrible, something ghastly happened and it affected the next generation. So that was the behind the scenes of the museum, was looking at her life and all the things that went wrong with her family.
Her personal family.
It could have been based on that to a degree, but just generally how, somebody who is a bad parent is probably, I don't think it's maybe her directly, no, I would say it's more that she was trying to sort of make a point of saying that people behave badly because of their parenting. So, if somebody goes to prison for doing something ghastly, they quite often say because they had bad parenting. So it is sort of every generation going back.
I read somewhere when I was looking this book up briefly before that it's there's sort of a discussion at one stage about where roads lead and whether all roads lead home or whether all roads lead away from home. Do you have any views? Whether all roads, I guess because it's sort of this lady trying to make a home with people. I don't know.
I think that's true. I mean, it depends, but I think you have to make your own, things. You travel, you go all over the world, say, but in the end, you want to come home, don't you? It's a family. A family is more important than.
I'd say all roads lead home, but I mean that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not exciting, adventurous roads.
Well, I think everyone has, but I mean, your family, you're very lucky. You've got a huge family, haven't you? Not everyone does have a big family. I mean, you've got lots of uncles and aunts, and there's many Arbuthnot's around in the world, so which is rather a nice feeling. And I think other people just don't have that. They just are very much on their own. Am I right?
Yeah. No, yeah, probably. And then maybe you're more inspired to create, well, I think anyone wants to sort of, well, I don't know whether roads lead somewhere.
Well, roads, no, it's interesting because, I mean, you have to take the road and make the best of it. So whatever road you're on, you really have to make the best of that road.
Yeah,
but it is
I agree with that.
Whereas, if you always feel you're in the wrong place and you should be somewhere else, I suppose then it leads to huge dissatisfaction. But yes, I know it's quite interesting that, but I think family, I don't know whether they mean that families are so important or your friends are more important, depending if you've managed to fall out with all your family. I don't think I have. I think I have.
Once, I'm going to move on to mine.
Yes.
A Just So story. And it is, I picked one that I haven't done yet. It's the beginning of the Armadillos. I don't know if you know the story.
Remind me, because I have read it, but it's not recently.
Well, there's this painted jaguar who's told by his mum that when he meets a hedgehog, he has to drop it in the water and then it will uncurl. And when he meets a tortoise, he has to scoop it out of its shell with his paw. And so this is only when he's really hungry and he's eaten the deer and the monkeys and the frogs and the beetles. So then he has to eat a hedgehog or a tortoise. So anyway, he meets this hedgehog and tortoise and he asks them, because he doesn't know which is which. So he makes a slightly silly mistake of asking which is a hedgehog and which is a tortoise. And then the hedgehog and the tortoise are quite clever. And they start sort of getting him into a complete puzzle. And they sort of say, they get him all confused, saying, are you sure what your mum said is right? And that maybe you have to uncurl a tortoise and shell him out of the water and pour a hedgehog and drop him on the shell, and getting everything muddled up. And so then it makes his spots ache because he gets so confused. And so then he does everything completely wrong, and he tries to scoop the hedgehog out. So he gets all these prickles on his paw, and then he drops the tortoise in the water, so the tortoise swims off. And so then this is, it's got lovely pictures as well. There's this picture here, which he doesn't really explain. He kind of explains on the side why he's included them. And this one is just because it has two armadillos at the top. And it's just an interesting map of different places and arrows on the rest of it. And then there's another picture here, which is the painted tiger at the top here. And then this is the armadillo, and there's the hedgehog and the tortoise in there too. And you can see his paw is bandaged by his mum because because he got so spiked. And then it says at the bottom, oh no, sorry, the painted jaguar, not the painted tiger. The jaguar's pet name with his mummy was Doffles. And so that's Doffles looking really confused at the top. And so he gets into such a confusion, poor Doffles, and then he goes back and asks his mum. Meanwhile, the hedgehog and the tortoise are deciding what they can do to stay alive. So they both, they start sort of trying to both swim and both curl up. And because the tortoise curls up, it kind of means that between its shells expands and breaks, kind of, you know, like an armadillo's. And so then this painted, the painted jaguar comes back and sees both these creatures curling themselves up and going round and round and round. And he gets into such a confusion that he goes back and says that he doesn't know what it is. And there's this funny thing that isn't a hedgehog and isn't a tortoise. And so the mother jaguar says, well, you should call it armadillo till they find out what the real name is and leave it alone. So the tortoise hedgehog is left alone. And to this day, the armadillos are still called armadillos because they were so clever, and they live happily there, while there are hedgehogs and tortoises in other places as well. But the armadillo just keeps going because it was able to fend off the...
I'm fascinated. I can't remember that story, but I watched a film based on a Rudyard Kipling story called The Man Who Would Be King. But it's a very, very short story, but it's made into one of the best films. It's called The Man Who Would Be King, and it's Rudyard Kipling short story. But are those all to do with animals?
Yeah, well, towards the end of the book, there is some more about how the alphabet was made and the first letter, but those are the only two. The others are all animals.
Okay, well, this is obviously a different book, but if you ever see it, it's a short story and it's just made into a film, which is one of the best films, called The Man Who Would Be King. And if you ever come across it, you must watch it. It's very good. But I love Rudyard Kipling, and I love all his poem If is just so wonderful.
That's brilliant. That's I mean, you could talk for hours on that one as well. That's
And
completely
the other poem he wrote was My Son John, which is terribly sad because his son John had terrible eyesight, but wanted to fight in the First World War. So he fixed it that John could go and fight in the First World War, and inevitably he got killed. So he wrote this incredible poem called My Son John, which is definitely worth looking at. It's very, very sad. And he never really recovered, after that. And John could have easily sort of ducked out of the First World War if he'd wanted to. It's bad. Anyway.
Well, we are indebted to him for his animal stories.
Yes,
well, I am. I take great inspiration.
Maybe I didn't start on the animal stories. Maybe I've done a few more of the what I call his other stories. But
yeah, well, they're happy, so I'd stick with the happy ones.
I'm just wondering whether to send you, if it's interesting or not, to send you a list of all the books I like the most, my top 10.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Well, funny enough, there was one book which I think that what I call is more of a boy's book. It's more that your father might like. And it's somebody called Ben McIntyre, because he writes lots of what I call spies. He writes about spies and wars. But it's still, I find them terribly interesting because it's a lot of history gets talked about, especially, spy stories. There's always something to do with history involved. So Ben McIntyre, but unless I come over and I could drop off some with you.
Yeah.
Should I do that?
All right, we can make a plan later. But for now, I think that's all your stories, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I could go rattling on, but I think that's about it. Otherwise, I can see you can get overwhelmed by too many ideas.
Yeah. I know we could. It's always, maybe we can have another chat another time about 3 more on another occasion.
Well, you are sweet. You are wonderful to do that. I think I have to talk about the goldfinch at some point, because
we'll do another chat.
Yeah, okay.
For this chat, I always finish with a literary fact, and you might know this one already, but do you know how many husbands Nancy Mitford had?
Yes, I do.
Oh, you do?
One.
What?
He was called Peter Rudd.
Oh, really? Well, I found out that she had 3. She was married first to Hamish Erskine, who was a homosexual, and that was 5-year infatuation, and that ended. And then she married Peter Rudd, who was clever but slightly delinquent.
Boring. Yes.
Separated. And then she had this Frenchman, Gaston Poeski, who she was passionate and loyal to for.
They never married though.
Oh, was maybe she certainly was married to, I think, the first one.
I think that Hamish Erskine, she never married. I think she just married Peter Rudd. But Hamish Erskine, I think, was she might have married him.
She had 3 infatuations. So.
Yes, well, she had 3 important relationships, but I think she only married once. But you could be right. But certainly Polanski is the basis for Charles Edward in The Blessing. He was
apparently he never returned her sort of. I mean, she was deeply loved him, but he never completely loved her.
I think, put it this way, he had amorous. Oh my God! Hang on, I've lost it.
There you are.
I'm running out of battery. He had lots of what I call Charles Edward type affairs all over the place. He was a very typical naughty Frenchman, but he adored her and she absolutely adored him. So I think it was maybe he just adored the person he was with at the time.
Well, she said, if one can't be happy, one must be amused.
Well, that is absolutely her. And that's why she had a lot of good friends. So there are lots and lots of books of her letters that she wrote to her sisters and also to other friends, like Evelyn Waugh and very famous people at that time. There are letters of hers all over the place because she had so many friends. And so I don't think she was lonely, but she was only in love, properly in love with Gaston, who was the basis for Charles Edward in The Blessing. You're right.
And before we finish, if you could be any character from any book, who would you be?
Oh, lordy, lordy, lordy. I'd have to say, I can't answer that. I'm going to have to think quite hard, because you want to have somebody who's good, more, has. I have to think. It's too much. I'll have to. I'll put it into my thought process, and I'll come back to you with that one.
Okay. Thanks, Angela. That's been really fun.
What a fun thing to do. I'm absolutely thrilled to pieces because you've given me food for thought, and I want to. Next time I see you, I'm going to sing. Bobby Shafto went to sea, silver buckles on his knee. He'll come back and marry me, Bonnie Bobby Shafto.
Thank you. I'll sing it too.
Yes, okay. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.